Now, moving on to our second speaker. I'm sure he's waiting in the wings, I hope. Hello, are you in the wings there? I just wanted to say that many of us grew up with our near and dear relatives as our heroes, but I think few of us were able to grow up with actual heroes in our family. Today we're going to hear from Warren Hanton, who's going to talk to us about two of his favorite heroes, and he's also got a special surprise for us, and I will let that explain itself toward the end of his talk. So let's give a big welcome to Warren Hanton. This might be where I dance. I don't see him. Oh, here he is. Okay. Great. Thanks, Warren. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. I would like to take a moment to personally thank the Committee of the Common Ground for extending me this opportunity to pay tribute to my uncles. My story is about two Kenora boys, my uncles Lloyd and Frank Hanton, who have always been my heroes since boyhood. I originally thought that my categorizing them as heroes was biased, being that they were family. But as I shared some of the stories with friends and acquaintances throughout growing up, I came to realize that they were true heroes, not only to me, but to their hometown of Kenora, as well as other Canadians. Upon reading the definition of the word hero, which states, a person admired for courage, outstanding achievements, possessing noble qualities, I knew that they more than qualified for this title. And now I would like to share some of the stories that brought me to the conclusion and this title. My father, Len, and his older brothers, Lloyd and Frank being the eldest, grew up on 3rd Street South, across from the 7th Avenue Bridge on Lawrence's Creek. When the creek would freeze over, all of the neighborhood kids would gather to play Canada's game, hockey, with whatever makeshift equipment that they had during the lean years of the late 1920s leading into the dirty 30s. Frank told me of the skates that he acquired, his first pair of skates, at 4 years of age. He said they had to be strapped to his boots, over the toes, and around his ankles, and they were quite difficult to use. By the age of 5, he got his first real pair of skates. They were 3 sizes too big, so that the toes had to be stuffed with newspapers, and I think anybody that played hockey here in Canora, as a young kid, we all had to do that. He had to be stuffed with newspapers until he grew into them. He told me that at that time, hockey sticks were anything from tree branches with any kind of bend in it that they could use as a blade, to also being homemade and nailed together scraps of lumber. And very rarely you would see a store-bought hockey stick. During that era, the most common and popular puck was manufactured in endless supply right here in Kenora by all the delivery horses. And they were aptly called horse pucks. Uncle Frank used to joke that he felt that these pucks were the main reasons that slap shots didn't come into being too popular. But he was one of the first in his neighborhood to have a regulation rubber hockey puck, which he'd found at the Canora Arena at the time. And while he and a group of his friends were playing shinny on the creek, he said that the puck got away from them and slid over to the thin ice that surrounded the outlet of the sewer pipes that fed into Lawrence's Creek. And my apologies go out to all you environmentalists in the audience, but that was a fact. So spreading his body out on the ice to disperse his weight, he crawled toward the puck. Inevitably, the ice gave out, and he told me I was in as well as up the creek when I got home. Frank reeking, getting home, Grandma made him strip to his underpants, and I heard this story from him and my grandmother. He had to strip to his underpants on the clothesline stoop outside the kitchen door, and she proceeded to pour 4 or 5 pails of water over him and his clothing before he was allowed in the house. Of course, the whole group of hockey players, having seen this, had to go up and watch, and they observed and howled with laughter. And at the end of this whole traumatic ordeal, he told me that the worst part of it all was that the puck had gone through the ice with him and he never got it back. But finally came a day when he'd bought a manufactured hockey stick. He told me that once he had it, I did all I could to make it last forever. And he spent endless hours on Lawrence's Creek, eluding the checking of his opponents to protect his prized hockey stick. All of his practicing of his hockey skills on Lawrence's Creek paid off for him. And in the 1939-40 season, he made the roster of the Canora Thistles Junior A hockey team in the Manitoba Junior Hockey League. This team became noticed Canada-wide by all teams that were considered contenders for the Canadian Junior A Championship Memorial Cup. The roster that season ran deep with skilled players. Their goalie was Charlie Rayner, who was also the team captain. Charlie went on to become a member of the Hockey Hall of Fame for his outstanding seasons with the New York Americans and then the New York Rangers of the NHL. Charlie's love for hockey and the surrounding area, Charlie's love for Kenora and the surrounding area never faded. In fact, it took little persuasion for him to talk another NHL goaltender, Winnipegger Sugar Jim Henry, into a partnership in owning a fish camp that they aptly named Hockey Haven, just east of Kenora. Another notable player on this team was Bill, labeled the Beast Juzda. Bill played many seasons in the NHL with the Toronto Maple Leafs and the New York Rangers. And Bill was a significant help with the Leafs winning 2 Stanley Cups. And he was also indicted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. The 1939-40 season, the Thistles went on to win the Turnbull Cup as Manitoba Junior Hockey League champions. This feat advanced them to the Abbott Cup Finals, which is the Western Canadian Junior A Hockey Championship. In that series, they faced the Edmonton Flyers. The Flyers organization tried to tilt the scales in their favor by scheduling the first game to start only 4 hours after the Thistle team had stepped off the train following a grueling 29-hour ride from Kenora to Edmonton. The Edmonton Flyer organization was criticized by the media across Canada for using this tactic. But Frank told me during the 29-hour train ride, Mr. Devine, the trainer, put them through demanding physical exercise regimes, including isometric muscle strengthening techniques, as well as running wind sprints and stops and starts in the actual train cars. Upon arrival, Game 1 ended in a 2-2 tie. But by Game 2, travel had caught up with the Canora Thistle team, and they were defeated 7-1. In the Edmonton paper, the victory was overshadowed by the title of the article, which was "The Fiercest Game Ever Witnessed." Edmonton's police department riot squad had to be called in to regain control of the on-ice mayhem that took place. One Thistle player had fought all but 2 Edmonton Flyers. That was our captain and our goalie, Charlie Rayner. The impact of this ordeal affected everyone who witnessed it, and apparently the Edmonton team as well. Edmonton Flyer player and future Hall of Famer Ken Reardon was quoted, "Kenora is not a team to fight with. We're done with that." So after the dust had settled, both teams traveled from Edmonton to Winnipeg, where the remainder of the series would be played. In the next 2 games, Kenora was victorious, with the scores being 3-1 and 6-5 in our favor. In the 5th game, Kenora had to fight back to tie Edmonton in the 3rd period, 2-2, thus giving the Canora Thistles the Abbott Cup and the title of Western Canadian Junior A Hockey Champions. The Western Canada Championship gave the Thistles a berth to the Canadian Junior A Hockey Championship Memorial Cup finals. This put our small town of Kenora back on the map, gaining hockey notoriety only surpassed by our previous 1907 Canora Thistles Stanley Cup champions. Their opponent in this series would be the Oshawa Generals. They were the reigning Memorial Cup champions. The Generals beat Kenora 1-0 in Game 1, 4-2 in Game 2. Kenora won Game 3, but fell short in Game 4, losing the game by a score of 4-2, giving Oshawa Generals their 2nd Memorial Championship in as many years. And this was the first time any team had won consecutive Memorial championships. Charlie Rayner, Bill Jusda, and Frank Hanton graduated from the Canora Thistle Junior A hockey to professional hockey the following season. Frank went to the International Hockey League's Hibbing Monarchs. He finished that season with 48 goals and 59 assists for 107 points, and that gave him the International Hockey League's scoring championship as a rookie. This accomplishment in his first professional hockey season did not go unnoticed. The Boston Bruins of the National Hockey League stepped up first to acquire Frank's proven scoring abilities and invite him to the following season's training camp. As it did for many great Canadian hockey players, World War II ended Frank's dreams of playing hockey in the greatest league in the world. Frank said it was an easy decision for him. Rather than attending the Bruins training camp, he volunteered his services to the Royal Canadian Air Force and went on to become a fighter pilot and then promoted to a squadron leader in Toronto's 400 Squadron. He now entered a new arena that, like hockey, required strategic thinking and teamwork to defeat their opposition. Frank participated in Dieppe Raid, as well as D-Day operations and many fighter night intruder and fighter reconnaissance missions. He would always say that he came through it quite well, but not without having some close calls. The one that he'd talked about that stands out in my mind was while he was on patrol, his Mustang got shot up badly, and he had to bail out over Normandy. Prior to ejecting, he'd been sprayed with oil from a leak in his cockpit and had caught fire. He said that he had landed in a field of stones and boulders and had smashed his knee badly and hurt his shoulder, as well as receiving burns to his face and body. He felt that he was extremely lucky to have been retrieved by the Allied forces and was taken for immediate medical treatment. He was one of many burn victims in World War II to receive experimental plastic surgery from a doctor named Dr. Archibald McKinnon, whose dedication to skin grafting and plastic surgery techniques in World War II gained him worldwide notoriety. Uncle Frank and all of the Allied Forces burn victims who received treatment from Dr. McKinnon formed a club they named the Guinea Pig Club. Frank said it was appropriate as they were all guinea pigs in helping to advance these new procedures. The bond in this club proved to be very strong as they reunited every year post-war in England. Uncle Frank and his wife Auntie Joyce attended these reunions every year and relayed to our family the enjoyment of hearing all of the stories, the camaraderie that went along with it at these reunions. So after being shot down and receiving 30 days of treatment, he was told he could retire and return to Canada to become a flight instructor. He refused this offer and said he would return to Canada after the war was over. So a month after being shot down and receiving treatment, he climbed back into the cockpit of a Mustang and returned to battle. Toronto 400 Squadron leader Frank Hanton went on to become the top scoring Allied Forces train buster in World War II. He was credited with the total destruction of 54 enemy munition and supply trains, as well as 9 enemy aircraft. And in recognition of his valor, courage, and dedication to duty, Frank was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Some of his other post-war recognitions were May 26, 1986. Lieutenant General D. McNaughton of the Canadian Armed Forces Air Command appointed Frank as the honorary aide-de-camp to the Lieutenant Governor. And it was in this capacity that Uncle Frank was the escort for Prince Charles and Princess Diana during their tour of Canada. And he took great pride in that assignment. In July of 1986, Chairman Sir Neil Cameron, Marshal of the Royal Air Force, along with World Fighter Pilots Association in England, honored Frank by commissioning the Wilkinson Sword Corporation to produce a steel commemorative sword with an 18-karat gold hasp, suitably engraved along the blade, and presented it as a tribute to his significant contribution to the World War II effort. In the spring of the year 2000, Frank had received an invitation to be the guest of honor in Halifax by the Department of National Defense, who is the sponsor for the Memorial Cup playoffs. This invitation was 60 years after participating in the Memorial Cup finals with the Canora Thistles himself. Frank explained to me that the Department of National Defense sponsorship was in recognition of all young Canadian hockey players who, despite having promising hockey careers ahead of them, put the game they loved aside to defend the country that they loved when its freedom was threatened. And so many of these young Canadian players did not return home. So the Department of National Defense paid tribute to all of them by sponsoring the Canadian Junior A Hockey Championship and naming the trophy the Memorial Cup in honor of them. Excuse me. When it was announced that Kenora would be hosting the 2017 Hockey Day in Canada event, I composed an article that was posted in the Daily Miner News on the 15th of February 2017. And basically it was a condensed version of Frank's Canora Thistle and World War II experiences. But prior to the Thistle NHL alumni game that took place at the Rec Center, and myself being a member of the Canora Thistle alumni, I was introduced to Ron McLean of Hockey Night in Canada. Mr. McLean, having read my story, told me that he wanted it to be the feature story in the broadcast of Coach's Corner being televised from Kenora. I met with Ron at his trailer on the harborfront about 8:30 in the morning prior to the broadcast. This is where he told me that his crew had searched and found the televised footage of my Uncle Frank dropping the official opening ceremony puck at the 2000 Memorial Cup, and that this would be televised with a tribute to Frank on Coach's Corner by him and Don Cherry. Well, I watched that, and while watching the broadcast, Don Cherry referred to my uncle's uniform as an Army uniform. Ron piped in and corrected him that it was Air Force. And then Mr. Cherry went on to state some statistics that my Uncle Frank had destroyed 8 enemy aircraft and 8 enemy supply trains. It then occurred to me that Mr. Cherry was not the only coach taking part on Coach's Corner, as Mr. McLean would help him out. It was shortly after the airing of this broadcast I received a phone call from a retired 400 Squadron officer, Carl Mills. He informed me that I'm behind one slide, pardon me. That's Uncle Frank dropping the puck at the 2000 Memorial Cup. My apologies. Mr. Mills informed me that the Air Force Heritage Foundation had just completed 7 original oil paintings, each depicting significant moments in Royal Canadian Air Force history. He told me that they had just completed the painting of my uncle, Frank, taking down a Messerschmitt, the first enemy aircraft destroyed in World War II by the RCAF. And as you can see, the detail is overwhelming. He went on to explain to me that the tag number on the side of the plane in the painting was acquired by them finding his logbook, which was located in a museum, a war museum in Victoria, BC. And this and the other 6 paintings that I'd mentioned are on display at Base Borden Military Museum. Uncle Lloyd, my hero that I'd never met. My grandma and his brothers told me many, many stories of his sense of humor and wit. Also that his best friends were life and laughter, and they followed him everywhere he went. And I could always see the mischief in his eyes, and I felt a connection when I looked at this picture throughout my life. Lloyd volunteered with the Royal Canadian Air Force at 18 years of age. His sense of duty and patriotism meant that he had to leave his hometown, his life, his family, and his love, Fern. Fern was Auntie Fern to me and my brother and my sister throughout her entire life. She'd rented a suite in her house to my mom and dad and their 2 children at the time, my brother and sister. And when I was born, her home was my first home. Mine is only an assumption as to the reason why she never married or had children of her own. The love we felt for her confirmed that she truly was our aunt. As I previously stated, Lloyd left Kenora at 18 years of age to attend crew training in Manitoba. After completion of the crew training, he went on to MacDonald No. 3 Bombing and Gunnery School in Brandon, Manitoba, where he graduated July 9th, 1943. He was dispatched overseas to Linton-on-Usk, Yorkshire, on the 13th of August 1943 on active duty as a mid-upper air gunner on a Lancaster bomber with the RCAF 408 Goose Squadron. And though Frank and Lloyd were both stationed at different bases, Frank, using his rank and position, was able to keep tabs on Lloyd and his sorties or missions. On November 23rd, 1943, Frank received the information that Lloyd and his crew did not return from Berlin and that their last communication was crossing the North Sea. Frank, without authorization, took his Mustang and searched for his brother and crew. He'd returned to base unsuccessful and almost out of fuel. Neither their plane or the crew were ever found. Lloyd's name, along with his crew, was placed on a memorial plaque in Runnymede, just outside of London. And since I've been a boy, I've known that my Uncle Lloyd had no headstone at Lake of the Woods Cemetery, and I had intentions on rectifying that by bringing him back to his hometown of Kenora. When I retired in 2016, I took this tribute to my Uncle Lloyd on. After gaining permission from the Royal Canadian Air Force, I was able to order a military headstone and had it appropriately engraved. I was also very fortunate to purchase the gravesite in the Lake of the Woods Cemetery that was right next to his father. Then I felt it would be appropriate to write and read a tribute of his short life and experiences at the memorial that I was planning on the 74th anniversary of his death. I decided to write it in the first person tense so that all who heard it might feel some sense of the fear that they felt and try to imagine how he and all young Canadian soldiers struggled to hang on to life each and every day during the times of war. With the information that I had acquired, along with family stories and letters he'd written home, as well as having access to all of his 5 sortie reports, it made this project possible for me to complete. I was in Toronto in the end of November 2016, and I met a fellow by the name of Johnny Blue in a tavern just off of Yonge Street. We conversed about veterans and that Remembrance Day had just passed, and I saw that we had a mutual respect for the service personnel. So I was comfortable in telling him the stories of my uncle and my planning to bring Lloyd home with a memorial service. And Johnny Blue, as it turns out, is a professional singer. I didn't know this at the time, till later on. Professional singer, songwriter, and a recording artist. And after hearing the stories I told him, Johnny convinced me to put it all together as a song rather than a poem. Didn't take much convincing, but he was the convincer. So we finished writing the song by phone and email, and it was time to record it. I then included my son Reese, who writes, performs, and records music in Winnipeg. We flew to Toronto, where Uglow Studio is located, and Johnny Blue, Richard Uglow, Reese, and myself completed the recording of For Freedom, Lloyd's song. Once all the editing was complete, I'd committed to sending a copy to the Chief Warrant Officer of the present-day 408 Goose Squadron, now a tactical helicopter squad. I'd made contact with him throughout my research and information, and he took a definite interest in what I was doing. This led him to playing the recording at the Battle of Britain parade at the 408 Squadron base in Edmonton during the inspection of the ranks. He told me that it was very well received, and then he went on to send it on Remembrance Day 2017 to all active 408 members that were overseas on Remembrance Day. Needless to say, I was honored. And in the same conversation, he told me that the commanding officer of the 408 Goose Squadron had authorized 2 HC-140 Griffin armored helicopters to travel to Kenora to provide a military flyby at the memorial that I was planning for my Uncle Lloyd. 4 days before the service was to take place at the Kenora's 116th Field Battery, I received a phone call from him stating that the flyby would have to be canceled due to the death of an active 408 Squadron member. But the 408 Squadron of Edmonton did, however, send 2 representatives to the memorial service that I was holding. Major Jim Shuchuk and Warrant Officer Mike Girard, seen here with my mother, sister, and brother at the Lake of the Woods Cemetery. And though his body was never found, on November 23, 2017, Sergeant Lloyd George Hanton was in a sense brought back to his hometown that he loved, Kenora, with his resting place now being next to his father. Now, I would like to share with you a song that was written as a tribute to Air Gunner Sergeant Lloyd George Hanton. Air Gunner Lloyd Hanton, I was 20 years old, and now my story will finally be told. To all those of you who have lived 20 years, may our sacrifice mean you don't feel the same fears. 30 Lancaster bombers would head out each flight. 7 hours we would fly all through the night. Back home 5 birds short, I can still hear their calls. I remember their laughter playing cards in the halls. 408 Goose was our name, flyboys bound by fate and a Lancaster plane. Canadian birds in the sky, for freedom through the war clouds of Europe we fly. Sortie after sortie, many faces have changed. Alone in my bunk, I feel death's prearranged. 23rd of November, 1943, Berlin the target, on orders we see. Bomb Berlin tonight, the order is clear. Is this my last flight? It's my recurring fear. We're over the target and we empty our bay, but the shrapnel we catch will determine our stay. 408 Goose was our name, flyboys bound by fate and a Lancaster plane. Canadian birds in the sky, for freedom through the war clouds of Europe we fly. We limp toward England across the North Sea. It's cold dark water, the last sight for me. The angels, I guess, were the voices I heard. Brother Frank against orders would search in his bird. Thanks for the try, Frank, though it was in vain. I'm here with my brothers, we don't feel any pain. 1949, they said a tribute we'll make. A lake beside my home became Hanton Lake. Now my name and the name of all my fallen brothers will remain for eternity, spoken by others. North Ontario lakes with your beauty and charms, I forever will be there with my brothers in arms. Goose was our name, flyboys bound by fate and a Lancaster plane. Canadian birds in the sky, for freedom through the war clouds of Europe we fly. 408 Goose was our name, flyboys bound by fate and a Lancaster plane. Canadian birds in the sky, for freedom through the war clouds of Europe we fly. Thank you. And in answer to an anticipated question that I didn't address in my story, I found that provincial governments had, starting with Manitoba, had started paying tribute to their fallen by naming unnamed lakes with their surnames of the fallen. It started in Manitoba and Ontario and Quebec picked up on it right away. And I've found Hanton Lake, and it's north of Red Lake. I have flown into it a couple times, and so I figured that might be, I didn't include that in my speech, and that might be one of the questions, so I just wanted to address that. And I think that's a provincial government did an unbelievable job for the people that gave the ultimate sacrifice to defend our freedom and a form of eternal life. Any questions? Thank you.